And of course, Murray Rothbard spotted this a long time ago when he studied the very beginnings, very origins of the idea of central banking. And think about this, at the very beginning of the American founding, you had people like Alexander Hamilton saying, here's an idea, let's have a bank run by politicians out of the nation's capital. Well, what do you think of that? And of course, the Jeffersonians were horrified at this because they knew that's what the Bank of England was, and they just fought a revolution against this kind of crooked system. It was the engine of British mercantilism. But of course, Hamilton and his fellow Federalists, who were also known as the Nationalists, they took the attack that Mel Brooks took in the movie History of the World Part 2, where Mel Brooks played the King of France. And he kept saying over and over again, a laugh line, it's good to be the king. And so Hamilton and the Nationalists thought, well, it's bad to be on the paying end of a mercantilist empire, but if you're on the collecting end, it's a good gig to be on the payee rather than the payer. So they wanted to run the bank. And here's what Murray Rothbard said about this in his book, The Mystery of Banking. He knew that one of the wealthiest men in America at the time was Robert Morris, and his compatriot, his political compatriot, was Alexander Hamilton. And here's what they were up to at the very beginning of the American Republic. He says, Morris and his compatriots wanted to reimpose in the new United States a system of mercantilism and big government similar to that in Great Britain, against which the colonists had rebelled. The object was to have a strong central government, particularly a strong president or king, as chief executive, built up by high taxes and heavy public debt. The strong government was to impose high tariffs to subsidize domestic manufacturers, develop a big navy to open up and subsidize foreign markets for American exports, and launch a massive system of internal public works. In short, the United States was to have a British system without Great Britain. That's Murray Rothbard. And of course, this is all true. This all came into being eventually. But at the time, there were some people, like Thomas Jefferson in particular, who said, wait a minute, this sounds like a bad idea. We just fought a revolution against this idea. Rothbard goes on to say that an important part of the Morris scheme, and those of you who knew Murray Rothbard, you could just hear him saying the words, the Morris scheme, he said, was to organize and head a central bank to provide cheap credit and expanded money for himself and his allies. The Bank of North America, that was the first one. The Bank of North America was deliberately modeled after the Bank of England. And so it was, but it only lasted about a year. Its currency became so unreliable and so suspect that it was privatized after only 1 year. But this political cabal centered in New York and Philadelphia and Boston, they never gave up. I mean, to this day, they pretty much control the financial markets, but their political descendants do. But they never gave up. And so what they did was Morris recruited whom Rothbard called his young disciple, Alexander Hamilton, who had no experience or education in finance or economics at all. He had a lot of experience in something else. I don't know what you would call it. Kissing up, I think, would be what the word. He as a very young man, he was George Washington's assistant, for example. And if you read the big Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Hamilton, you'll read of how he got the job as Treasury Secretary. Robert Morris, the richest man in America, who had was also made a lot of money as a defense contractor. Maybe he was probably the founding father of defense contractors, Robert Morris. He got Hamilton the job. Hamilton knew nothing about finance. And here's what Ron Chernow, the biographer of Hamilton, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his biography, said happened. He said, at the end of the American Revolution, and at the very end of the war, he says this, quote, Hamilton brushed up on monetary matters, because he knew nothing about monetary matters. And he had Colonel Timothy Pickering send him some primers. David Hume's political discourses, tracts written by the English clergyman and polemicist Richard Price, and his all-purpose crib, Postlethwaite's Universal Dictionary of Trade and Commerce. So Hamilton knew nothing about trade and commerce, so he read a dictionary. Then he goes on to say, Hamilton sent a marathon letter to Morris that set forth a full-fledged system for shoring up American credit and creating a national bank. And of course, Hamilton knew that this is what Morris wanted. He wanted, the Bank of North America was Morris's bank. He wanted a bank run by politicians that would provide cheap credit to him and his business partners. And so here's the kiss-up, Alexander Hamilton. writing a letter. He works for the most famous and powerful man in America, George Washington, as his assistant during the Revolutionary War. The war's almost over, and Hamilton's wondering, what do I do next? So he writes a letter to the richest man in America with the help of people who actually knew something about finance, and says, I think your ideas for the economic policy after the war are perfect, you're right on. And so it's quite the kiss-up letter. And then in Cherno's book, he says that when George Washington learned that Robert Morris was recommending Hamilton to be the first Treasury Secretary, George Washington turned to Alexander Hamilton and said, I didn't know you knew anything about finance. We never talked about it. But if Robert Morris wants you in the job, I'll put you in the job. So he was essentially Morris's puppet. And not just Morris, but other people. He was sort of the chairman of Goldman Sachs, of the day. It's sort of that, put in as Treasury Secretary. Some things never change, do they? Maybe he was sort of the Corzine of his day, I guess. He was Goldman Sachs chairman also. And so he wrote this big long, it was a 30-page letter he wrote to Morris. And so Hamilton began championing the creation of an American version of the Bank of England. And here's one of the things he wrote, making the case for a bank run by politicians out of the nation's capital. What a great idea. He says, and I'm quoting Hamilton, Great Britain is indebted for the immense efforts she has been able to make in so many illustrious and successful wars. Now there's a case for a new bank. He says, because of the existence of the Bank of England. He spoke of what he called, quote, imperial glory. We can have more imperial glory if we have a bank run by politicians. And then he says this, the tendency of a national bank is to increase public and private credit, and the former gives power to the state for the protection of its rights and interests. Power to the state. So the whole purpose of the central bank, of course, was to give power to the state. And of course, Hamilton, he was constantly badgering George Washington as Treasury Secretary, saying we need a government of more energy, government of more power. He thought the Constitution was far too weak, far too limited, and he devoted the rest of his life to doing everything he could to undermine the Constitution. It was Hamilton who invented the idea of implied powers of the Constitution, for example, when he made his case for the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States. That's where this idea came from, that clever lawyers like himself could somehow reinterpret the Constitution on their own and invent new powers. That was Hamilton's legacy. And so that was the purpose of the first bank. And Hamilton did succeed. We had the Bank of the United States as the successor of the failed Bank of North America. And it's well known, if anyone ever studied Hamilton, that he was quite the Machiavellian in politics. He was very brilliant, and he was a workaholic also. And so that can be a great combination. Steve Jobs was brilliant and a workaholic, so was Bill Gates. But if you have somebody who's a brilliant workaholic in politics, that can be very dangerous. And Hamilton is known for championing a large public debt for the sake of having a large public debt, because his reasoning was that it would be the wealthier people of the country who would own the government bonds, and they would therefore form a permanent lobbying group for bigger government and higher taxes forever, because they would want to make sure there was enough money in the Treasury to pay off the principal and interest on their debt. And so that was his reason for a big public debt. It wasn't necessarily to finance anything, but just to become an engine of governmental growth. And so one of his first gambits in trying to do this was the Bank of the United States. There was one of the editions of the Federalist Papers was edited by Douglas Adair. In the foreword, Douglas Adair wrote this about what Hamilton did as Treasury Secretary with the help of his party. He said this, with devious brilliance, Hamilton set out by a program of class legislation to unite the propertied interests of the Eastern Seaboard into a cohesive administration party, while at the same time he attempted to make the executive dominant over the Congress by lavish use of the spoils system, handing out goodies to politicians and jobs, government jobs. In carrying out this scheme, Hamilton transformed every financial transaction of the Treasury Department into an orgy of speculation and graft. in which selected senators, congressmen, and certain of their richer constituents throughout the nation participated. So Graft paying off politicians to support his big government agenda is how he ran the Treasury Department. And one of the biggest gambits that he undertook, he with the help of his political cronies, was really one of the really first big political insider trading schemes, where the government was about to nationalize the debt of the states, and they were to pay off. The government was going to buy up this debt at face value. And at the time, some of these bonds that had been in the pockets of Revolutionary War veterans who were paid partly in bonds and not currency were trading between 2 and 10% of value, of face value. And so the insiders, members of Congress, the political insiders, people who were closely associated with the Federalist Party, they knew this. They knew the government was going to buy up these bonds at 100% of face value. And so they went on a wild spending binge, going up and down the eastern seaboard, buying up all these bonds from the Revolutionary War veterans and whoever else owned them, because they knew that in the near future they could sell them at 100%, buy them at 2% and sell them at 100%. And there's a biography of Hamilton and Jefferson by Claude Bowers. I think the book is called Hamilton and Jefferson. It's a famous old 1920s era biography. And here's how he explained what happened. He says this, quote, imagine this going on. Imagine members of Congress, literally members of Congress, hiring people to drive stagecoaches to North Carolina and all over the place to buy up these bonds. He says expresses, by which he meant stagecoaches, with very large sums of money loaded with cash, are on their way to North Carolina for purposes of speculation in certificates, splashed and bumped over wretched winter roads. 2 fast-sailing vessels chartered by a member of Congress who had been an officer in the war were plowing the waters toward southward on a similar mission. And so they went on a mad dash, and they bought up all these bonds, and they made a pretty good profit on it. Robert Morris made at least $18 million in this. Governor George Clinton made $5 million. Hamilton himself bought the bonds, but quote, through buying agents in Philadelphia and New York. And although Chernow, in his biography of Hamilton, claims that, well, yeah, Hamilton participated in this personally, but the money that he made, he gave to his brother-in-law as a gift. He says that. And so when you read some of these biographies, you get a lot of good belly laughs out of it.